For years, people believed the truth behind one of the most powerful criminal networks in modern history was locked away, buried in sealed court files, protected records, and restricted investigative archives. Names were whispered, allegations circulated, questions refused to die. Then, without warning, the vault opened. Millions of investigation records connected to Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier at the center of a global sex trafficking scandal, were released into the public domain. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions of pages, documents, interviews, logs, communications, legal filings, and investigative material collected over years by federal authorities. It was one of the largest disclosures ever connected to a criminal investigation involving elite power circles. The scale alone was staggering. Legal experts described it as a historical release. Journalists scrambled. Analysts worked around the clock. Survivors watched closely. Critics demanded accountability. Supporters of transparency called it overdue. Within hours, the story surged back into global headlines. A case many thought had reached its final chapter suddenly felt open again. Because the Epstein case was never just about one man. It was about access, influence, protection, silence. It was about how someone with extraordinary wealth and connections was able to operate for years while allegations accumulated around him. And when he died before trial, many believed the full truth might never surface. But now, pages that had been sealed were visible. Records once discussed only behind closed doors were now subject to public examination. The disclosure did not deliver simple answers. Instead, it delivered something more unsettling: complexity, contradictions, connections that required careful interpretation. The kind of material that forces societies to confront uncomfortable questions about power and accountability. The release triggered a shockwave not because it created a new scandal, but because it reopened an unfinished one. It reminded the world that the Epstein investigation reached into places most criminal cases never do: elite social circles, political environments, corporate networks, and international relationships. When files of this size are opened, they do not just reveal facts. They test reputations, institutions, and public trust. This story is not driven by rumors. It is driven by records, testimony, timelines, decisions made, and decisions avoided. And over the next episode, we're going to walk through this story carefully, piece by piece, separating documented events from speculation and understanding what the release of these files actually means. If you value careful, evidence-based true crime storytelling, cases that examine power, systems, and consequences, subscribe to Real Crime Saga now and turn on notifications. Because some stories are not just about crime. They are about how truth survives pressure. To understand why this document release matters, we must begin where the story truly starts, with the man whose name became synonymous with one of the most controversial criminal investigations of the century. And that man was Jeffrey Epstein. To understand why the release of these investigation records shook the world, we need to understand the figure at the center of it all: Jeffrey Epstein, a man whose public image, private conduct, and social reach formed one of the most troubling contradictions in modern criminal history. Jeffrey Epstein did not begin life among the global elite. He came from a modest background in New York City and worked his way into finance through a combination of timing, positioning, and relationship building. Early in his career, he moved through teaching and then into the financial sector, eventually presenting himself as a specialist in managing money for extremely wealthy clients. Unlike high-profile Wall Street executives, Epstein maintained an unusual level of opacity around his actual business operations. He cultivated mystery as much as credibility. What is clear is that he became very wealthy. He owned multiple luxury properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Paris. His residences were not simply homes, they were social environments. He hosted private gatherings, intellectual salons, and invitation-only meetings. He positioned himself as a connector, someone who could bring together scientists, politicians, royalty, business leaders, and cultural figures in the same room. This strategy worked. Over time, Epstein built a network that extended into the highest levels of influence. Photographs, flight records, and social calendars showed that he moved comfortably among powerful people. His circle included billionaires, political figures from different parties, academic leaders, and internationally recognized personalities. He cultivated relationships deliberately, offering funding for research projects, philanthropic support, and access to exclusive networks. Association with him often appeared beneficial. But behind that cultivated image, allegations were growing. By the early 2000s, reports began to surface that Epstein was involved in the sexual exploitation of underage girls. These were not isolated rumors. Multiple individuals made statements to authorities. Investigations began at the state level. Law enforcement gathered testimony suggesting a pattern. Not a single incident, but repeated conduct involving minors. What happened next became one of the most criticized prosecutorial outcomes in American criminal justice discussions. In 2008, Epstein entered a plea agreement in Florida. He pled guilty to charges related to soliciting a minor for prostitution. Despite the seriousness of the allegations and the number of reported victims, the agreement resulted in a sentence widely viewed as extraordinarily lenient. He served a short custodial term with work release privileges that allowed him to leave jail for extended hours during the day. The deal also granted immunity protections to potential co-conspirators, an element that later drew intense scrutiny. Legal observers, victims' advocates, and journalists questioned how such an agreement was reached. Critics argued that the outcome reflected preferential treatment influenced by wealth and legal leverage. Prosecutors involved later defended their decisions, stating they believed the agreement secured at least some accountability. But the perception damage was done. The case became an early example cited in debates about inequality within the justice system. Importantly, the 2008 conviction did not end the allegations. It paused them publicly, but investigative interest continued. Civil lawsuits followed. More individuals came forward. Journalistic investigations expanded. The story did not disappear. It evolved. Those earlier legal outcomes became central to later outrage, because when new federal charges emerged years later, many people asked the same question. If the earlier investigation had gone further, could later harm have been prevented? That unresolved tension between what was known and what was prosecuted would shape everything that followed. And more developments were coming. The next turning point would arrive more than a decade later, and it would bring the case back into the global spotlight with far greater force than before. For more than a decade after his controversial 2008 plea deal, Jeffrey Epstein lived publicly but quietly. Civil lawsuits continued. Investigative journalists kept digging. Survivors kept speaking. But there was no major federal prosecution until 2019. That year marked the turning point that transformed a troubling case into a global firestorm. In July 2019, federal authorities arrested Epstein at an airport in New Jersey after his private jet landed from overseas. The charges were severe: federal sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. Prosecutors alleged that Epstein operated a system in which underage girls were recruited, transported, and abused across state lines. The indictment described a pattern of exploitation supported by staff, resources, and properties under his control. This was not treated as a reopening of the old case. It was presented as a new federal prosecution built on expanded evidence and additional witness testimony. Investigators executed searches on his residences, including his New York mansion, where authorities reported recovering large volumes of photographic material and other items later cataloged as evidence. The message from prosecutors was clear. This time, the case would proceed at the highest federal level. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Major news networks led with the story for days. Survivors who had previously settled civil claims gave new interviews. Legal analysts revisited the 2008 plea agreement and questioned how the earlier case had ended so narrowly. Political figures were asked about past associations. Corporate leaders faced questions about social ties. The phrase Epstein Network began appearing in headlines and commentary panels. Unlike earlier coverage, this wave did not fade quickly. It intensified. The scale of alleged conduct, combined with Epstein's documented access to powerful circles, created sustained media pressure. Every court appearance generated global attention. Each newly unsealed filing became breaking news. The case had moved from scandal to national reckoning. Epstein was denied bail and placed in federal custody in New York. Prosecutors argued he was an extreme flight risk due to wealth, international connections, and access to private aircraft. The court agreed. He would remain in jail pending trial. Then, 1 month later, the case took a shocking turn. In August 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his jail cell. Authorities later ruled his death a suicide by hanging. He died before trial, before cross-examination, before a jury could hear evidence, before the full federal case could unfold in court. The reaction was unlike anything normally seen in custodial death cases. Suspicions spread instantly. Questions multiplied. How could one of the most closely watched detainees in the country die while under federal supervision? Why were certain monitoring procedures reportedly not followed that night? Why were there reported staffing irregularities? Why did security protocols appear to fail? Multiple investigations were launched into the jail's procedures and personnel conduct. Reports later identified serious lapses, including staffing shortages and failures to complete required checks. 2 correctional officers were charged with falsifying records related to their duties that night. Institutional accountability became a separate legal track from the trafficking case itself. But public doubt did not disappear. Instead, it expanded into widespread conspiracy theories, some claiming coordinated silencing, others alleging elite protection networks. Law enforcement officials rejected those claims, but the timing and circumstances ensured that suspicion became permanently attached to the case narrative. For survivors, the emotional impact was severe. Many had prepared to testify. Many expected public trial proceedings. His death removed the possibility of direct criminal conviction on the federal charges. Although civil actions and related prosecutions could still proceed, the central defendant was gone. Yet the case did not end, because investigators had long maintained that Epstein did not operate alone. Attention now shifted to associates, facilitators, and enablers, especially one name that appeared repeatedly in testimony and records: Ghislaine Maxwell, and her role would soon move from background figure to central defendant. When Jeffrey Epstein died in custody, one immediate question dominated public discussion. If the operation described by prosecutors and survivors was real and sustained, could it truly have been run by one man alone? Investigators had long suggested otherwise. Witness statements, civil filings, and prior investigative records repeatedly pointed to assistance: logistical, social, and operational. And at the center of those allegations stood one figure more prominently than any other: Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was not an unknown background name. She moved in elite circles long before Epstein became a household scandal. The daughter of a powerful British media proprietor, she grew up around influence, privilege, and international access. After her father's death and the collapse of his media empire, she relocated to the United States and rebuilt her social standing within high-wealth environments. It was during this period that she became closely associated with Jeffrey Epstein. To the outside world, Maxwell appeared to be a sophisticated social connector, someone who introduced people, organized gatherings, and navigated high society with ease. She attended events, appeared in photographs with influential figures, and maintained visibility within elite networks. But behind that public image, allegations accumulated that her role was far more direct and far more troubling. Multiple accusers stated that Maxwell acted not merely as a companion or associate, but as an active participant in recruitment and grooming. According to sworn testimony presented in later proceedings, she allegedly approached young girls, built trust, normalized inappropriate interactions, and facilitated introductions to Epstein. Several survivors described her as present during encounters and, in some accounts, directly involved in abusive conduct. These were not single-source claims. They appeared across multiple civil suits and investigative interviews over time. For years, Maxwell denied wrongdoing and avoided criminal charges, even as civil litigation expanded. But after Epstein's death, investigative momentum increased rather than slowed. Federal prosecutors signaled that the case would not close simply because the primary defendant was gone. Evidence already collected, communications, witness statements, travel records, remained actionable. In 2020, Maxwell was arrested by federal authorities. The charges included conspiracy and enticement of minors related to the same broader pattern of exploitation described in the Epstein investigations. Her arrest marked a critical shift. The case now had a living central defendant again. Prosecutors argued that she played an essential operational role, not a peripheral one. Her trial drew intense global attention. Survivors testified in court. Prosecutors presented documentation and corroborating evidence. The defense challenged credibility, timelines, and motives. The proceedings were closely watched because they represented something many believed had been lost with Epstein's death: the possibility of courtroom examination under oath. In 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted on multiple federal charges related to sex trafficking and conspiracy involving minors. She was later sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment. The verdict was widely described as a landmark moment for survivors who had pursued accountability for years across both civil and criminal systems. But the conviction also reinforced a larger investigative conclusion. This was not a solo offender case. Courts, prosecutors, and juries had now formally recognized that facilitation and collaboration occurred. That legal reality intensified public demand for broader transparency. If two individuals were criminally established within the operation, were there more who knowingly enabled it? Who provided resources? Who ignored warning signs? Who benefited from silence? Those questions grew louder after the conviction, not quieter. Because criminal networks, especially those operating within protected social environments, rarely depend on one or two people alone. They depend on systems of access, discretion, and non-interference. Investigators had gathered material for years that touched communications, movements, and contacts beyond the two most visible defendants. Much of that material, however, remained sealed, and that secrecy, more than anything, set the stage for the next chapter: the long battle over hidden records and the demand to open them. After the arrest of Jeffrey Epstein, and later the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell, many observers assumed that the core facts of the case would now be fully visible. Charges had been filed. Evidence had been presented in court. Testimony had been heard. But behind the courtroom victories and headlines, a large portion of the investigative record remained locked away, sealed by legal order, procedural rules, and privacy protections. The public saw outcomes, but not the full archive behind them. Court systems often seal materials for specific reasons: to protect victims, preserve fair trial rights, safeguard ongoing investigations, and prevent the release of unverified allegations. In most criminal cases, sealed records eventually become a minor footnote. In the Epstein matter, they became a central controversy. The volume of restricted material was unusually large. Over the years, investigators had collected interview transcripts, communications, contact lists, travel logs, financial traces, search warrants, and internal memoranda. Civil lawsuits had produced depositions and sworn statements. Some filings referenced individuals who were never charged. Others contained allegations that had not yet been tested in court. Judges approved sealing orders across multiple jurisdictions at different times, creating a complex patchwork of restricted access. For survivors, this secrecy was painful and personal. Many had already faced years of legal struggles simply to be heard. Some believed sealed records concealed patterns that would validate their accounts and expose broader responsibility. Others feared that continued secrecy protected reputations more than victims. Advocacy groups argued that transparency was not only about public curiosity, it was about institutional accountability and survivor recognition. Investigative journalists shared a different but overlapping concern. Reporters who had worked the case for years knew that fragments of information were scattered across court systems, agencies, and civil proceedings. They filed repeated motions to unseal documents, arguing that the public interest threshold had been clearly met. In several instances, news organizations formally petitioned courts, stating that the scale and gravity of the case justified disclosure, with appropriate victim protections. Lawmakers also entered the debate. Some members of Congress questioned how such a far-reaching criminal enterprise could be investigated without broader public reporting. They raised concerns about earlier prosecutorial decisions, investigative gaps, and oversight failures. Hearings and public statements referenced the need for greater openness, especially where government decision-making was involved. Courts responded cautiously. Judges reviewed requests document by document, often balancing competing interests: privacy versus transparency, allegation versus proof, protection versus disclosure. Some records were partially unsealed with heavy redactions. Others remained fully restricted. The process moved slowly, sometimes taking years per document set. This slow pace created a tension gap between public expectation and legal procedure. The public wanted clarity and completeness. The courts prioritized fairness and protection. That gap became fertile ground for speculation. In the absence of full records, rumors multiplied. Partial disclosures were interpreted beyond their legal weight. Names appearing in filings were sometimes treated by commentators as proof of wrongdoing, even when no charges existed. Legal experts repeatedly warned that inclusion in an investigative record is not the same as criminal liability, but nuance travels slowly in high-emotion cases. Meanwhile, survivors and transparency advocates kept pushing. Each unsealed fragment strengthened their argument that more remained hidden. Each redaction raised new questions. Each delay renewed criticism. By this stage, the secrecy itself had become part of the story, not just what the records contained, but why they were still closed. Pressure continued to build across legal, media, and political channels. Motions accumulated. Reviews expanded. Oversight discussions intensified. Eventually, that sustained pressure would produce a structural change. Not just another court ruling, but a formal mechanism compelling broader disclosure. And that mechanism would trigger the largest release of Epstein-related investigative records the public had ever seen. By the time multiple prosecutions had concluded and years of litigation had passed, the Epstein case had entered a different phase, not just criminal accountability, but institutional accountability. The question was no longer only who committed crimes. It had expanded into how the system handled the investigation, what decisions were made behind closed doors, and whether the public had a right to see the underlying records. Pressure for disclosure did not come from a single direction. It came from survivors, journalists, civil rights groups, and lawmakers, each for different reasons, but converging on the same demand: open the files. The legal push for transparency did not happen overnight. It developed through layered action. First came repeated court motions from media organizations seeking to unseal specific filings. Then came civil litigants requesting access to materials referenced in their proceedings. Judges were asked again and again to reconsider prior sealing orders. Each request forced courts to revisit a central tension in the justice system: the balance between privacy protections and public oversight. Privacy concerns were not theoretical. Many records contained identifying details of victims who had already endured trauma. Some documents referenced individuals who were investigated but never charged. Courts are traditionally cautious about releasing material that could permanently damage reputations without due process. Defense attorneys and civil liberties advocates argued that disclosure without conviction risks turning allegations into lifelong stigma. They warned that public release of raw investigative material could undermine fairness. On the other side stood transparency advocates who argued that secrecy had already done damage. They pointed to the earlier plea agreement, investigative delays, and institutional failures as evidence that sunlight was necessary. They argued that when a criminal enterprise intersects with wealth and power, secrecy protects the wrong people. They emphasized that trust in justice systems depends not only on outcomes, but on visible process. Legislative attention followed. Lawmakers raised formal inquiries about sealed records and investigative handling. Oversight discussions began examining whether statutory mechanisms could compel broader disclosure while still protecting victims. Proposals focused on structured release, redaction standards, identity shielding, and phased publication. The goal was not uncontrolled exposure, but supervised transparency. At the same time, appellate court rulings in related civil matters began narrowing the scope of acceptable sealing. Judges increasingly required specific justification rather than blanket restriction. Legal standards evolved from seal by default toward justify each redaction. That shift mattered. It changed the burden from the requester to the withholder. Government agencies also faced internal review pressure. Oversight bodies examined record handling practices and disclosure authority. Questions arose about whether some materials could be released administratively without violating court orders, particularly records not directly tied to pending prosecutions. Legal teams evaluated classification categories: what must remain sealed, what could be partially disclosed, and what could be open entirely. What emerged was effectively a three-way legal tension. First, victim protection, ensuring survivors were not re-traumatized through exposure. Second, due process, ensuring uncharged individuals were not publicly condemned without trial. Third, public interest, ensuring that investigations involving systemic failure and elite influence were not hidden indefinitely. The debate was not ideological alone. It was procedural, technical, and deeply legal. Redaction protocols were drafted. Review teams were formed. Courts issued conditional unsealing orders. Legislators advanced transparency mandates tied to protective frameworks. What had once been scattered motions became structured disclosure planning. Eventually, the combined force of court rulings, legislative direction, and administrative review produced a requirement for large-scale release. Not total openness, but unprecedented volume. Investigative materials would be disclosed in bulk, subject to defined redaction rules and privacy safeguards. The vault would not be opened recklessly, but it would be opened. And when that release finally occurred, it would become one of the most extensive investigative disclosures in modern criminal justice history, triggering the next major shockwave in the Epstein saga. After years of sealed records, legal battles, and mounting public pressure, the moment finally arrived. The Department of Justice announced the release of Epstein-related investigative materials, and the scale of what was disclosed stunned the public and media alike. This was not a simple drop of documents into an online portal. It was a meticulously planned operation to make millions of pages of sensitive information accessible while balancing legal, ethical, and logistical constraints. The released materials included correspondence, emails, financial records, flight logs, interview transcripts, witness statements, and evidence files accumulated over decades of investigation. These were documents that, until that point, had been seen only by law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and certain court personnel. The sheer volume of the release was extraordinary. Millions of pages spanning multiple jurisdictions, and thousands of pieces of ancillary evidence, including photographs and records of communication between Epstein, his associates, and third parties. The materials covered decades of activity and provided insight into the extensive network that had supported and facilitated Epstein's operations. Logistically, the release was unprecedented. Every page had to be reviewed to ensure compliance with court orders and legislation protecting victims' identities and the privacy of individuals who were not charged with crimes. Redactions were applied carefully and strategically, focusing on sensitive personal data while preserving the evidentiary and narrative content of the documents. Legal teams coordinated across federal agencies to prevent any accidental violations of court protections. Every file was categorized, verified, and then uploaded or made available through controlled access channels to accommodate both public inquiry and journalistic scrutiny. The moment the release became public, it triggered immediate global attention. News outlets reported on emerging patterns, recurring names, and high-profile connections. Legal analysts began parsing flight logs and correspondence. Investigative journalists started cross-referencing dates and events to identify systemic patterns and connections previously hidden from public view. Social media amplified the impact, allowing fragments of information to spread rapidly and provoke public debate about influence, complicity, and justice. Importantly, while the release was immense, it was not total. Redactions remained in place, and certain files were withheld due to privacy concerns, ongoing investigations, or legal limitations. This created a tension. The public now had unprecedented insight into Epstein's operations, but the very nature of redactions and withheld documents fueled continued speculation about what was still concealed. Even so, the scale of disclosure was historically significant, and the release marked a turning point in public understanding of the Epstein case. This was the first time that so much of the investigative record had been made accessible in one coordinated event. It transformed abstract allegations into tangible, examinable evidence. For survivors, journalists, and the public, it was a long-awaited step toward transparency. For the institutions involved, it was a demonstration of the intricate balance between openness, privacy, and the procedural complexities of federal investigations. The release did more than provide documentation. It reframed the narrative. Names that had only been whispered were now in print. Connections that had been implied could now be traced through evidence. And the public was left with the task of making sense of a massive archive of records. The next chapter of the Epstein saga, where analysis, interpretation, and accountability would collide. From this point onward, the focus would shift to the content itself. The patterns, relationships, and revelations contained within millions of pages that had remained hidden for years. The sheer scale of the document release was unprecedented, but the question on everyone's mind was simple. What exactly was inside these millions of pages? To understand the significance, it is necessary to examine the types of material disclosed and the insights they offered, without speculation, sensationalism, or assumption of guilt. The records, meticulously cataloged and carefully redacted where necessary, revealed a broad range of investigative information collected over years, spanning multiple jurisdictions and covering both criminal and civil proceedings. One of the most prominent categories was contact lists and communications. Investigators had collected extensive documentation showing Epstein's networks of associates, staff, and individuals connected to his residences and enterprises. These records included email exchanges, correspondence, phone logs, and handwritten notes. They detailed patterns of communication that illustrated how Epstein maintained connections with his associates, managed logistics for his operations, and coordinated with individuals in his orbit. For investigators, these records were central to understanding operational structure and relationships. For the public, they offered unprecedented visibility into the extensive scope of his connections. Travel and flight records formed another significant component. Epstein's movements across the United States and abroad had long been the subject of scrutiny, and these logs confirmed extensive travel, including private flights on his jets and stays at various properties. Flight logs and itineraries documented who traveled with him, where they went, and when. These records were critical for both investigators and journalists in mapping interactions, timelines, and associations. They also provided insight into the scale of his mobility and access, highlighting how travel facilitated the maintenance of his network over extended periods. The release also contained interview summaries. Federal investigators and civil litigants had conducted numerous interviews with survivors, witnesses, staff, and other individuals connected to Epstein and his operations. These summaries documented testimonies, patterns of behavior, and corroborating details. While some of these records included direct allegations, others provided context for understanding relationships, organizational structure, and recurrent behaviors. These materials were central to ongoing investigative analyses, though it is crucial to note that they represented statements rather than judicial determinations. Legal motions and investigative notes comprised another substantial category. These documents revealed how prosecutors and investigators assessed evidence, planned actions, and responded to legal challenges. They offered insight into procedural decisions, case strategies, and judicial interactions. For scholars, journalists, and oversight bodies, these files provided a rare view into investigative methodology in a case of extraordinary complexity. Finally, the documents included numerous references to high-profile individuals. Names appeared in communications, flight logs, or other records, sometimes in direct contact with Epstein, sometimes indirectly connected through networks or events. It is critically important to emphasize that appearance in these records does not automatically imply criminal conduct. Inclusion in a document could indicate presence, association, or mention without evidence of knowledge or participation in any illegal activity. Proper context is necessary before drawing any conclusions, and investigators cautioned against assuming guilt based solely on name recognition. Taken together, the documents revealed a complex and extensive operation, mapped across communication networks, geographical locations, and social environments. They offered unprecedented transparency into Epstein's activities, his relationships, and the scale of the investigative effort. But equally, they underscored the need for careful, measured interpretation. Records, after all, are evidence, raw, incomplete, and requiring analysis. They illuminate the structures of an operation, but they do not determine guilt on their own. The release was a record of information, a lens through which the public could now examine the case. But it also served as a reminder that transparency is only the first step in understanding accountability, responsibility, and justice. The moment the Epstein documents became publicly accessible, the response was immediate and intense. News outlets around the world began reporting on the contents, with journalists and analysts combing through the millions of pages for patterns, connections, and potentially actionable information. Headlines dominated every major platform. Social media amplified every revelation, and public discourse surged into an unprecedented wave of scrutiny. It was, in every sense, a media frenzy. For many, the release validated long-held suspicions about the breadth and complexity of Epstein's operations. Survivors' advocacy groups seized the moment to emphasize that the investigation had involved not just one man, but a network of facilitators, enablers, and individuals who had knowingly or unknowingly supported criminal behavior. Public interest grew because the documents confirmed that Epstein's sphere of influence touched not just minor victims, but high-profile social and political circles. The revelations provoked debate about how wealth and access had shielded him for so long from full accountability. Political reactions followed swiftly. Lawmakers and commentators questioned why earlier investigations had failed to achieve comprehensive justice, scrutinizing both prosecutorial decisions and institutional oversight. Some called for further inquiry into the roles of government agencies and public officials, demanding answers about potential complicity or negligence. Committees in multiple countries began reviewing related documents. While some elected officials referenced the records in calls for policy reform, greater protection for victims of sexual exploitation, and more robust transparency standards for high-profile criminal investigations. The document's references to high-profile individuals drew particular attention. Photographs, flight logs, and communications mentioning prominent figures quickly became focal points for news stories and online commentary. Speculation spread rapidly, and some public discussion blurred the line between documented presence and criminal involvement. Here, the tension between public curiosity and legal responsibility became apparent. While many wanted immediate judgments, legal experts repeatedly reminded observers that being mentioned in the records was not evidence of guilt. Names appearing in communications or travel logs did not automatically indicate knowledge of or participation in criminal conduct. Misinterpretation of these details risked unfairly harming reputations and diverting attention from substantiated evidence. Journalists, legal analysts, and scholars responded by providing context, cautioning against jumping to conclusions and highlighting the distinction between association and culpability. Some outlets dedicated extensive resources to verifying patterns, cross-referencing timelines, and contextualizing appearances in the documents. Others focused on the broader narrative, showing how an elite network, unchecked for years, had allowed criminal behavior to continue largely unchallenged. Public debate also extended to social ethics and cultural commentary. Discussions emerged about the power of wealth, social privilege, and institutional influence in shielding perpetrators. The release sparked questions about the mechanisms that allow certain individuals to evade scrutiny and the societal responsibility to hold elites accountable, regardless of status. Forums, panel discussions, and investigative podcasts proliferated, illustrating the intense public demand for explanation and transparency. In the midst of this attention, however, caution remained crucial. Legal observers reminded the public that the documents were evidence to be examined and interpreted, not proof of criminality by association. The distinction between being named in records and being legally culpable was repeatedly stressed, even as the public and media struggled to contain their focus on high-profile figures. Ultimately, the release of the Epstein documents created a dual reaction: a surge of attention, scrutiny, and debate on one side, and a reminder of the limits of interpretation on the other. The fallout underscored how public perception, media framing, and the presence of elite names in legal materials can collide, shaping discourse even when legal conclusions remain pending. The case had evolved beyond individual crimes. It had become a societal reckoning about accountability, influence, and justice. And yet, even with this wave of public scrutiny, questions persisted. Questions about the full extent of the network, the identities of those who enabled it, and the lessons institutions should have learned remained unresolved. This tension between revelation and interpretation, transparency and judgment, would carry forward as the documents continued to be examined in unprecedented detail. While the release of millions of Epstein-related documents was hailed by many as a historic act of transparency, it was not without controversy. The disclosures answered some questions, but they also raised new ones. Critics quickly pointed out that, despite the sheer volume of material made public, a significant portion of the records remained withheld or heavily redacted. Entire sections of correspondence, financial logs, and investigative notes were obscured, leaving gaps in the narrative. For many observers, these gaps were more than minor omissions. They represented potentially crucial pieces of the puzzle, capable of clarifying the roles of associates or revealing systemic failures that had allowed Epstein's network to operate largely unchecked for years. Journalists and legal analysts questioned why certain records remained sealed. In some instances, the justification was standard legal procedure, protecting the privacy of individuals who were mentioned but never charged, or shielding victims from exposure. In others, the rationale appeared less clear, leading to speculation about political influence, institutional self-preservation, or strategic delay. The tension between public interest and legal safeguards became immediately apparent. Some argued that transparency was fundamentally incomplete until every document, fully unredacted, was available for review, while others acknowledged that certain limitations were necessary to prevent harm or prejudice ongoing proceedings. Victims' advocacy groups were similarly divided. Many celebrated the release as an overdue step toward accountability, emphasizing that it gave survivors unprecedented visibility into the scale and operation of Epstein's network. For these advocates, seeing the records publicly affirmed that their allegations were taken seriously and that the patterns of abuse and facilitation were now accessible for wider scrutiny. Yet others expressed frustration that the release did not go far enough. They argued that without full disclosure, with redactions carefully masking names, dates, and interactions, it was impossible to understand the full extent of complicity or to hold all parties accountable. For them, justice was partial, incomplete, and delayed. The public debate extended beyond survivor circles. Scholars, legal experts, and commentators discussed the implications of releasing documents in bulk. Some praised the effort as unprecedented in scale, demonstrating a willingness by federal authorities to confront difficult historical records and provide a resource for research, journalism, and oversight. Others cautioned that the bulk release could overwhelm analysts, encourage misinterpretation, or create the illusion of disclosure while leaving critical questions unanswered. The balance between openness and responsible use of the information became a central theme in media coverage and professional analysis. Complicating matters further, the presence of high-profile names in some of the documents intensified public scrutiny and speculation. Even heavily redacted materials fueled conversations about privilege, power, and accountability. Observers debated whether influential individuals had evaded accountability through wealth, connections, or the structure of the legal system. The debate underscored a persistent tension. Transparency had been achieved to a point, but complete clarity remained elusive. In the end, the controversy highlighted a fundamental truth about the Epstein case and the document release. Transparency alone is not justice. While the release marked a historic step toward understanding, it did not resolve the larger questions about institutional responsibility, the full extent of the network, or the role of those who facilitated or ignored the crimes. Public attention, legal interpretation, and survivor advocacy continued to push for answers, keeping the conversation alive even as millions of pages sat open for scrutiny. The release was both a revelation and a reminder. In cases entangled with wealth, power, and secrecy, transparency is a process, not a conclusion. And the next chapter of this story would revolve around the unresolved questions and the enduring challenge of accountability. Questions that remain central to the Epstein saga today. Even after the unprecedented release of Epstein's investigative records, after courtroom convictions and media scrutiny, the story remained far from complete. The documents answered some questions, but they also exposed the limits of public knowledge and left a series of unresolved issues that continue to captivate investigators, journalists, and the public alike. These questions strike at the heart of the case, the intersection of criminal conduct, wealth, influence, and institutional oversight. The first question is perhaps the most fundamental. Who knew what and when? Epstein's operations spanned decades, involved multiple properties across the United States and abroad, and implicated countless individuals in varying capacities. The documents revealed extensive communications and interactions, but the context behind many of these contacts remained uncertain. Did some associates knowingly facilitate exploitation, or were they simply unaware of the criminal activities occurring around them? Determining the knowledge, intent, and responsibility of those connected to Epstein is a legal and moral challenge, made more complex by the passage of time and the death of the central defendant. Closely related is the question of whether all collaborators have been identified. Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction confirmed that Epstein did not operate entirely alone, yet investigators and analysts suspect that additional facilitators may have been involved. The released records hint at the existence of other individuals who played roles, either logistical, financial, or social, in sustaining Epstein's network. The identities of some of these people remain undisclosed, either protected by legal constraints, redactions, or incomplete investigation. The possibility of further undiscovered collaborators ensures that public interest in the case remains high and raises questions about whether justice has been fully served. Another unresolved issue concerns further prosecutions. Epstein's death closed the chapter on his criminal trial, but civil lawsuits, secondary criminal cases, and potential future prosecutions against co-conspirators remain possible. The released documents provide prosecutors and journalists with a wealth of evidence, but deciding whether to pursue new charges involves weighing the strength of evidence, statute of limitations considerations, and the challenges of proving complicity years after the alleged crimes. These considerations mean that the legal system may continue to confront aspects of the Epstein network for years to come. Finally, the documents' renewed focus on institutional failures. The Epstein case exposed systemic weaknesses within law enforcement, prosecutorial discretion, and the broader judicial system. Critics continue to examine how decisions in earlier investigations, including the 2008 plea agreement, may have enabled Epstein to continue his criminal activities. The release of new material highlighted questions about whether oversight mechanisms failed, whether influential individuals benefited from procedural gaps, and how policies and practices can be reformed to prevent similar lapses in the future. These are not simply theoretical concerns. They speak to public trust in institutions charged with protecting the vulnerable and enforcing the law. In essence, the Epstein documents provide insight without finality. They illuminate patterns, networks, and behaviors, but they leave critical questions unanswered. Who was aware of the operations, who enabled them, and who might yet face consequences are all matters that remain unsettled. Similarly, the broader societal and institutional questions about privilege, accountability, and oversight persist. As the case continues to unfold in public discourse and potential legal proceedings, these unresolved questions serve as a reminder. Even with millions of pages of documentation, true understanding of Epstein's network and the failures that allowed it to exist requires persistent investigation, scrutiny, and reflection. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not merely a record of past crimes. It is an ongoing lesson about power, secrecy, and the complexities of justice. The release of Epstein-related investigative documents represents a historic moment in the intersection of criminal justice, public interest, and transparency. For the first time, millions of pages, meticulously collected over decades, were made accessible for public scrutiny. The documents revealed the vast scope of Jeffrey Epstein's network, the extensive contacts and communications that sustained it, and the evidence collected by law enforcement to understand and prosecute the crimes committed. It is a release of extraordinary scale, one that will occupy journalists, researchers, and legal analysts for years to come. Yet, it is equally important to recognize what the release does not represent. Public access to these materials does not automatically equal full accountability. Epstein is deceased, the primary defendant in a case of extraordinary complexity, and while Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted, the larger network that the documents hint at remains partially obscured. Not all collaborators have been identified, and institutional failures highlighted by the records have yet to be fully addressed. Names that appear in communications or travel logs are not, in themselves, evidence of criminal guilt. Interpretation requires caution, context, and a disciplined approach to distinguishing between documented presence and culpability. Despite these limitations, the release fundamentally reshapes the public record. For survivors, it provides affirmation that their allegations were not ignored, and that the scope of the crimes committed against them is now a matter of documented history rather than speculation. For the public, it offers insight into how power and influence operate within criminal networks, revealing a system where wealth, privilege, and secrecy can allow exploitation to persist undetected for years. For institutions, it is both a lesson and a warning. Accountability requires vigilance, and transparency, even partial, exerts pressure on systems to do better. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from this release is the collision of power, secrecy, and justice. Epstein's case demonstrates how individuals with extraordinary influence can manipulate networks and evade scrutiny, but it also shows that no system is entirely impermeable. Legal processes, persistent advocacy, investigative journalism, and public scrutiny eventually force the disclosure of a massive body of evidence. It is a reminder that power may shield, but it cannot indefinitely silence accountability. In the end, the Epstein document release stands as a complex milestone, monumental in scope, sobering in implication, and incomplete in resolution. It forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about the interplay of privilege, exploitation, and institutional responsibility. It underscores that while transparency is vital, justice is never automatic, and the work of understanding, reforming, and holding accountable is ongoing. As viewers, scholars, and citizens examine the released records, the broader question remains: how do we ensure that lessons from this case are not forgotten? How do we confront systems that allow secrecy to shield wrongdoing? And how do we support those who demand justice? The Epstein saga, though historic in its revelations, reminds us that when power and secrecy collide with justice, the consequences, both seen and unseen, are profound, lasting, and unavoidable. This concludes our exploration of the Epstein document release. The story is far from over, but the record has been forever changed.